Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, I invite you to step into a story that began almost 4 centuries ago, in a time of hardship, faith, and incredible vision. It is the story of a young man whose name has echoed across generations, even though he lived only a short life. His name was John Harvard. You may already know Harvard University, the world's most influential institution of higher learning. But do you know the man whose name it carries? Behind that name lies a story of resilience, sacrifice, and unshakable faith in education. This is not just a history lesson. It is a journey into one man's extraordinary decision that shaped the future of an entire nation. Through this story, you will not only improve your English but also discover timeless values, courage in the face of illness, generosity that reaches beyond death, and the belief that knowledge can transform lives. Get ready for a tale that may surprise you, move you, and perhaps even inspire you to reflect on your own legacy. If you'd like to support our work, you are welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support means a lot and helps us keep going. Now, let us begin the journey of John Harvard, his struggles, his choices, and the founding legacy that still guides us today. The story of John Harvard begins in England in the early 17th century, a world that was turbulent, divided, and filled with uncertainty. John was born in 1607 in Southwark, a lively but rough district just across the River Thames from the heart of London. Southwark was known for its crowded streets, busy markets, and theatres where Shakespeare's plays were performed. But it was also a place where disease spread quickly, where poverty was never far away, and where life was often short. John grew up in a family that reflected both struggle and opportunity. His father, Robert Harvard, was a butcher, respected in his trade but vulnerable to the dangers of urban life. His mother, Catherine, was a woman of faith, who tried to raise her children with strength and piety. Yet tragedy struck the Harvard family early and often. Several of John's siblings died young, a common fate in a time when medicine was limited and outbreaks of plague were frequent. When John was still a boy, his father died, leaving the family shaken. Not long after, he also lost his mother. By the time he reached his teenage years, John had faced more death and grief than many experience in a lifetime. Yet out of this hardship came resilience. John Harvard discovered comfort and meaning in his Puritan faith. Puritanism was a movement that sought a stricter, purer form of Christianity, demanding discipline, education, and a deep personal relationship with God. For many, it was also a protest against corruption and control in the established Church of England. These convictions shaped young John's outlook, giving him both comfort and a sense of mission. Despite the loss around him, he was not left without support. Catherine's second marriage had connected the family to people of influence, and John found opportunities through the church and the growing respect for education among Puritans. In 1627, he entered Emmanuel College at Cambridge University, one of the leading centers of Puritan thought. At Cambridge, he studied classical texts, theology, and the traditions of the church, sharpening his mind while deepening his faith. Imagine him walking through the ancient courtyards of Cambridge, carrying his worn books, surrounded by stone walls that had stood for centuries. For John, education was not just about knowledge, it was a way to understand God's world and to prepare for a life of service. His years at Cambridge marked the beginning of a path that would eventually stretch far across the Atlantic Ocean. But the England of John's youth was not a place of peace. It was a land divided by conflict, religious tensions, political unrest, and the struggles of a society searching for identity. Out of this uncertainty, John Harvard would soon be tested, forced to make choices that would define both his faith and his destiny. When John Harvard left Cambridge, he stepped into a world that seemed increasingly hostile to the values he held most dear. England in the 1630s was a country trembling with tension. King Charles I ruled with a firm hand, and under his authority, the Church of England pressed for conformity. For Puritans, who longed for a simpler, stricter, and more biblical form of worship, this was a time of frustration and danger. John had been trained to serve as a minister, yet the very church he wished to serve was closing its doors to those who questioned its practices. The king demanded unity, but that unity came at the cost of conscience. Sermons were censored. Ministers were silenced. Families who refused to conform faced fines, imprisonment, and social exclusion. For John Harvard, the challenge was not simply about career or status. It was about living in truth. Should he remain in England, suppressing his Puritan convictions, or should he seek another path, even if it meant leaving behind his homeland? This inner conflict was not unique to him. Thousands of Puritans wrestled with the same dilemma. Some chose quiet submission, hoping for change within. Others began to dream of a new world, a place across the sea where they could worship freely and build a society rooted in their beliefs. Yet the question was not only spiritual. It was also deeply personal. John Harvard had survived the grief of losing both parents, but his health was fragile. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, haunted him throughout his life. It was a disease that wasted the body slowly, leaving victims coughing, fevered, and weak. John knew his years might be short. How, then, should he use them? To live cautiously in England, hoping for acceptance, or to take the risk of starting anew in the unknown wilderness of America? In 1636, this question pressed harder when persecution grew worse. The king dissolved Parliament, ruling by decree, and the bishops tightened their grip on religious life. For men like John, the air in England seemed to grow heavier each day. Friends and fellow Puritans began to depart for New England, a land they described in letters as both harsh and hopeful. There, they said, was a chance to plant not just crops, but a vision, a city upon a hill that might shine as an example to the world. The choice was agonizing. To leave England meant abandoning familiar streets, books, and friendships. It meant long weeks across a stormy ocean and the risk of hunger, disease, or even death in the colonies. To stay meant safety of place but a silence of conscience. For a man trained to speak truth and teach the gospel, that silence was unbearable. This was John Harvard's emerging problem, the collision of fragile health, political oppression, and the longing for a meaningful life. He was not yet the benefactor we remember, nor the symbol of Harvard University. He was simply a man torn between the comfort of what was known and the call of what was possible. Dear learners, pause for a moment here. If you had been in John's position, what would you have chosen? To stay in safety, or to risk everything for freedom and faith? By the late 1630s, John Harvard's decision was taking shape. He would leave England, not only to escape the suffocating control of church and crown but also to embrace the promise of a new beginning in New England. The choice was filled with risk. But for John, the thought of living without freedom of faith was even more unbearable. In 1636, a turning point came when John married Anne Sadler, the daughter of a respected Puritan minister. Their marriage was more than a union of hearts, it was also a bond of shared conviction. Together, they dreamed of a life built not on fear but on hope, a place where their faith could breathe freely. Anne's support gave John courage, even as his health weakened. For a man battling tuberculosis, the idea of crossing the Atlantic was daunting. Yet he believed his life would be wasted if he did not use what strength remained for a higher purpose. When John and boarded the ship bound for Massachusetts Bay, they joined what history calls the Great Migration. Thousands of Puritans were leaving England, trading comfort for uncertainty, and shaping the future of what would one day become America. Imagine John standing on the deck of the ship, the salty wind in his face, London's fading skyline behind him. Ahead lay weeks of rough seas, cramped quarters, and sickness that spread quickly among passengers. For a man already ill, the journey was perilous. But John pressed on, driven by conviction. When they finally arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637, the world that greeted them was harsh and raw. Life in New England was no paradise. Settlers struggled with bitter winters, poor harvests, and constant threats from disease. The wilderness pressed close, and survival demanded both courage and cooperation. Yet among the small wooden houses and meeting halls, there was also a sense of purpose. These colonists had not come for wealth but for the chance to build a godly society, a community shaped by Puritan ideals. For John Harvard, this was both a relief and a new challenge. At last, he could preach and live without fear of persecution. But the colony was fragile, its people weary and its resources thin. Ministers were desperately needed, schools were scarce, and books were rare. John, with his Cambridge education, quickly became a respected figure. He was asked to serve as a teaching elder in the church at Charlestown, just across the river from the small settlement that would one day become Boston. Here John faced the struggle of balancing his calling with his failing health. Each sermon cost him energy. Each winter weakened him further. Yet he gave himself fully to his work, believing that even if his days were short, they could still matter. His sermons inspired hope, his learning offered guidance, and his generosity began to mark his reputation. Still, beneath his outward strength lay a man fighting both physical pain and the knowledge of time slipping away. Tuberculosis does not rush, it lingers, forcing its victims to live with the shadow of death each day. John must have wondered, would he have enough time to leave behind something lasting? Would his life, cut short by illness, still carry meaning beyond his grave? This struggle was not one of despair but of transformation. John Harvard was learning to see his fragility not as weakness but as urgency. His journey across the sea was not only about escaping persecution, it was also about giving what little he had for the sake of others. He did not yet know how far his influence would reach, but in the quiet meeting houses of New England, the seeds of his legacy were already being sown. By 1637, John Harvard and his wife were trying to settle into life in Charlestown. The New England colony was still young, its people holding tight to their faith as they built farms, homes, and churches in a wild and unforgiving land. Yet beneath the determination of the settlers lay a serious problem, one that would soon demand John's attention in a decisive way. The Puritan leaders of Massachusetts Bay believed education was not a luxury, but a necessity. How could their society survive if future generations of ministers, leaders, and thinkers had no training? The colony needed an institution that could prepare young men in the same way that Cambridge and Oxford trained students in England. Without it, the dream of a godly society could collapse into ignorance. In 1636, the General Court of Massachusetts, a small governing body, voted to establish a college. It was a bold and almost impossible idea. They had no building, no books, no steady income, and no teachers. They had only determination. A site was chosen in Newtown, later renamed Cambridge, But the project seemed far beyond their means. Settlers were struggling just to survive the winters. How could they spare money, land, or energy to build a college? This was the moment when John Harvard's personal journey collided with the colony's great need. He was only 30 years old, already weakened by consumption, and aware that his life might soon end. But instead of despair, John saw an opportunity. If his time was short, he could still plant something that would live long after him. In 1638, the turning point arrived. John fell gravely ill. The disease that had haunted him since youth was finally overtaking his body. Anne, his devoted wife, cared for him as best she could, but everyone knew the outcome was near. In those final months, John reflected on his life, on the losses of his childhood, on the faith that had carried him across the ocean, and on the fragile colony now struggling to build its future. He had no children to inherit his possessions. What could he leave behind that would matter? With quiet resolve, John made his decision. In his will, he left half of his modest estate and his personal library of around 400 books to the new college. To us, this may not sound extraordinary. But in a colony where books were rare and money was scarce, this was an immense gift. His library alone was one of the largest in New England at the time. It would give future students access to knowledge they could not otherwise have found. John Harvard died in September 1638, at just 30 years old. His life, measured in years, was painfully short. But his final act of generosity became the turning point not only in his story but in the history of America. With his gift, the struggling dream of a college gained both resources and legitimacy. Just 2 years later, in 1639, the General Court named the school Harvard College in his honor. Think about that for a moment. A man who never saw his 40th birthday, who preached only briefly in a small colonial church, became the namesake of one of the most powerful educational institutions in the world. Why? Because he chose, in his last act, to give not to himself, but to the future. Dear learners, ask yourself, if you knew your days were limited, what would you choose to leave behind? Would it be wealth, words, or something deeper, an act that could inspire others for centuries? For John Harvard, the turning point came not in a great public victory, but in a quiet, personal decision. His legacy began not with what he kept, but with what he gave away. The last months of John Harvard's life were filled with both suffering and profound clarity. Tuberculosis, the wasting disease, had taken hold of his body, leaving him weak, coughing, and fevered. Each breath came with effort. Each day seemed borrowed from time already lost. Yet within this slow decline, John carried a vision brighter than the shadow of death. He could see around him the fragility of the colony. Families endured bitter winters in drafty wooden homes. Food was scarce, and disease often swept through the settlements. The colony's leaders dreamed of an educated ministry and a learned citizenry, but dreams alone could not build a college. Without books, funds, and encouragement, the vision would fade. John knew this better than anyone. He had seen the power of Cambridge University in England, the way it shaped minds and sustained movements. Could not such a place, even in its simplest form, change the destiny of this struggling colony? Yet the cost was personal. John had little by the standards of the wealthy. His estate was modest, and would soon be left a widow in a harsh land. He could easily have chosen to secure her future, keeping everything for her support. That choice would have been natural, even expected. But John saw another path, one that demanded sacrifice. In the quiet of his home, John Harvard made the decision that would define his legacy. He divided his estate, giving half, along with his treasured library of 400 books, to the fledgling college. It was a gift that would take from his widow and from his own memory of comfort. Yet it was also a gift of faith, a declaration that knowledge and truth were worth more than personal wealth. Picture that library for a moment, volumes of theology, philosophy, history, and the classics, carried across the ocean from England. In a world where books were rare treasures, these were the seeds of a new intellectual tradition in America. John did not simply give money, he gave the tools of thought, the instruments by which generations could wrestle with questions of faith, morality, and human purpose. The sacrifice was not only financial. It was deeply human. John was giving away not what was left over, but what was essential. His choice meant and would live with less security, and his own memory would be tied forever to something he would never see completed. He was giving to the future, to people unborn, trusting that the colony would honor his gift. And indeed, his decision was not without inner conflict. He must have wrestled with doubt. Would the college survive? Would his books be used wisely? Would his sacrifice mean anything, or would it be forgotten in the wilderness? These questions had no certain answer. What John gave was not only his estate, it was his faith that knowledge, once planted, would grow. In September 1638, John Harvard breathed his last. He was only 30 years old, his body broken by disease, but his spirit steady. His death was mourned by the small Puritan community, but none could yet imagine how far his influence would reach. The following year, the colony named the new institution Harvard College, a recognition not just of his gift, but of the spirit behind it. This was the climax of John Harvard's story, a moment where a man facing death chose to give beyond himself, where sacrifice became a seed of legacy. It was not a dramatic battlefield, nor a throne room decision, but a quiet, personal act, one that carried the weight of centuries. Dear learners, pause here for reflection. What does it mean to give away what you cannot keep, in order to build something that will last? John Harvard answered this question with his life. His choice reminds us that greatness is not measured by years lived, but by the values we leave behind. John Harvard did not live to see the outcome of his decision, but the seeds he planted through sacrifice quickly began to grow. In 1639, just 1 year after his death, the General Court of Massachusetts declared that the new college in Newtown would bear his name, Harvard College. It was an extraordinary recognition for a man who had been in New England less than 2 years, who had never held public office, and who had left behind no children. His legacy was his gift, and the faith it represented. That decision gave the colony something priceless, a symbol. Harvard College was not only an institution, it was a declaration that education mattered, even in a place where daily survival was still uncertain. Settlers could look to the college and see hope for their children. Ministers and teachers could imagine a future where knowledge flourished alongside faith. And all of it was linked to the memory of a young minister who had given away what little he had for the sake of others. The college began humbly. Its first students studied in wooden buildings with few comforts. They used John Harvard's books, some worn by travel, others heavy with theological commentary. Their lives were strict and simple, filled with prayer, study, and work. But they carried in their hands the resources John had provided, and in their minds the vision he had made possible. From those small beginnings, Harvard College grew steadily. It trained ministers, lawyers, and leaders who shaped the colony's laws and churches. Over time, it became not only the intellectual heart of New England but also a foundation for American identity itself. By the 18th century, Harvard graduates were central to the American Revolution, guiding the fight for liberty with minds sharpened by study. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Harvard had become one of the most influential universities in the world, a place where presidents, writers, scientists, and thinkers found their voice. Yet all of this, every lecture, every discovery, every leader it produced, traced back to one fragile man and his act of faith. John Harvard's achievement was not measured in personal titles or accomplishments during his lifetime. It was measured in the enduring institution that bore his name, an institution that turned his brief life into centuries of influence. There is also a deeper victory here, one that goes beyond Harvard University. John Harvard's story reminds us that even in weakness, one can create strength. Even in poverty, one can give wealth. Even in death, one can give life to future generations. His short years were marked by illness, grief, and hardship, yet from those ashes rose something enduring. Dear learners, perhaps you have asked yourself at times, can my small actions really matter? John Harvard's story answers with a resounding yes. His library and estate were modest by worldly standards, but they were given with such conviction that they became the cornerstone of a legacy beyond imagination. Greatness is not always about doing more, sometimes it is about giving what you have with all your heart. Harvard College today stands as the visible victory of John Harvard's invisible sacrifice. It is a triumph not of wealth or power but of vision, faith, and generosity. The story of John Harvard is not just the story of a man, it is the story of how one life, however brief, can transform the future of countless others. When we look back at his 30 years, we see more loss than most could bear, the death of parents, the frailty of health, and the knowledge that his days were numbered. Yet from that fragility rose a strength that still shapes the world nearly 4 centuries later. His legacy can be understood on several levels. First, it is the legacy of education. John Harvard's library and estate made possible the survival of a college that has since become a global symbol of learning. Generations of leaders, thinkers, and creators have walked its halls, carrying his name into every corner of the world. Without his gift, the colony's dream of an institution for higher learning might have withered in its infancy. Second, it is the legacy of generosity. John did not give from abundance, he gave from scarcity. His estate was modest, and his books were precious to him. Yet he gave them away, not for personal glory but for the service of others. That spirit of giving, of using one's resources to lift others higher, is perhaps the greatest lesson his life teaches us. Third, it is the legacy of faith and vision. John Harvard believed that education was not only about knowledge but also about truth, morality, and service. He trusted that what he planted in a fragile colony would one day grow into something strong. He never saw the results, but he acted as if they were certain. That is vision, to give today for a tomorrow you will never see. And finally, his legacy is deeply human. John Harvard reminds us that our value is not determined by the length of our life or the comfort of our days, but by the purpose we pursue. He shows us that even in suffering, we can create hope. Even in weakness, we can leave behind strength. Dear learners, pause with me here. What kind of legacy do you dream of leaving? It does not need to be a university or a public monument. Sometimes the greatest legacies are the lives we touch quietly, the seeds we plant in others through kindness, teaching, or courage. John Harvard's life whispers across the centuries that greatness is possible, even in obscurity. His gift was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of countless others. And as long as Harvard University stands, his name will continue to remind us that one choice, one act of giving, can echo through history. Dear learners, we have reached the end of John Harvard's story, but in truth, his story never really ends. Every student who opens a book at Harvard University, every leader shaped by its halls, every discovery that emerges from its classrooms, all of these are part of his living legacy. From a life cut short by illness came a vision that still breathes life into education across the world. His example is a reminder for all of us: you do not need long years or great wealth to make a difference. What you need is faith, courage, and the will to give. John Harvard once wrote no famous words, yet his life speaks with a voice stronger than any book he left behind. His gift whispers across centuries: use what you have, however little, for the sake of others. So as you finish this story, ask yourself, what will be your gift to the world? It may be knowledge, kindness, creativity, or courage, but whatever it is, it matters. You too can leave behind something that endures. If John Harvard's journey inspired you today, share his story with someone else. Let it remind them, as it has reminded us, that true greatness is found in generosity and vision. And if you'd like to support our work, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. Your encouragement helps us continue creating meaningful stories that bring both English learning and inspiration to life. Until next time, dear learners, keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep believing that your choices today can shape tomorrow. Goodbye for now.